All right, so let me open it up here. 5.9 from the beginning and from the beginning. All right, so it is Daniel chapter 9. We're not going to read the whole thing because I believe there's a whole prayer in there. But let's just do a quick recap then. So we've studied the prophecy 3 times so far, right? So the first one, Daniel 2, which was the statue, the four main metals, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then this divided end, right? This thing is always like a divided thing. In
Mhm.
Daniel 7, very, very similar. So lion, bear, leopard, beast. In this case, it's a dragon or a dinosaur. But same empires, right? Same kind of a thing. Except that when we get to the 10 horns, like the 10 feet, this new horn appears, right? And it gives us kind of some detailed of this kind of special half empire, half religious kind of entity, right? And then in Daniel 8, uh, again, it's very, very similar, except that we start with Medo-Persia. Because by the time Daniel gets this vision, Babylon is already in decline, right? So it's like, I'm not going to look backwards. I'm going to, stay focused forwards. And so it actually starts with Medo-Persia, then Greece, and then again it goes to that little horn and so on. The one thing that's similar in all of these is the ending, because it talks about this judgment or this final reign, right? Where God kind of comes in um, and we have the new king, right? God is our new king. The other thing that's similar is that each time Daniel gets these visions, he gets upset, and sick because he fully thought, okay, Babylon took over Israel, but God was angry, but God will get over it, and He'll give us our land back, and things will go back to normal, right? But then he hears about all these empires, and every time he reads it, the prophecy seems to kind of get even longer, right? Um, and so he gets really sick, especially by Daniel 8 when he reads that not only are all these empires going to happen first, but they actually attack God's people and destroy the temple, all the stuff like that, right? In Daniel 9, Daniel basically, you know, he prays to God. He's like, God, don't let this happen, kind of a thing, right? In Jeremiah, you said it was going to be 70 years. So let it just be the 70 years, and give us our land back. Um, and literally, kind of right in during the prayer, God answers and gives him again this message of what's going to happen, which is again very similar to everything before. Um, so I'll let you read it, Sam, so I don't talk the whole way through.
Sure.
Read the first 2 verses. It's exactly what I just said right now, but just read it from the Bible.
In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the
Sure.
lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem.
All right. So that's what he wants, right? He's like, God, I read the Bible. You've been telling me this prophecy that's going to take years, but look, I found a better prophecy. This one's only 70 years. So let's stick with this one, right? Let's go with this one. Um, and that's when the prayer happens. So if you read, the prayer is actually really nice. It's actually Jeremiah saying, "Listen, we screwed up. I totally get it. We're sinners. We deserve the punishment that we got. We deserve to be destroyed. But please forgive us, right? Please don't just cast us out for thousands of years, kind of a thing, right?" And so he's literally doing this prayer, and this is where verse 20 comes in. And it says, Now while I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sins of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me at about the time of the evening offering. All right. So literally he's praying, begging God for forgiveness and, like, let's stick with Jeremiah. And this angel flies into his room. Right. And it's not just any angel, which is kind of cool. It's Gabriel, the same guy that talks to Mary and Joseph. And he appears in Daniel a few other times. So he's one of the few angels that we like know by name. In fact, I think he might be the only one that we know by name. Well, outside of Lucifer, but he turned bad, so we don't consider him. Um, so he flies in, and so obviously this is going to be connected to everything that he's been praying about, right? Like this is his answer to prayer. Verse 22. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. All right. So listen, I know you've been perplexed. I know you've had questions. If you remember Daniel chapter 8, the last prophecy that we had, it ends off with this huge prophecy, right? This 2,300 day, which we know equals years, before the temple is cleansed, right? And so he's like, no, that's way too much. That's way, that's crazy. And so Gabriel shows up and he's like, listen, I'm going to give you understanding. I'm going to explain what you heard, right? Well, this prophecy that you saw. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. So the vision that he's talking about here is from chapter 8, because he hasn't said a vision yet, right? Like I'm going to explain the vision. Obviously the question is, well, which one? And since we haven't had a vision yet, it has to be from chapter 8, right? So I'm going to explain this whole 2,300 year until the sanctuary is cleansed kind of a thing. Read this one for us, verse 24.
70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy.
All right. So this is really important. What Gabriel is telling Daniel is this. Listen, out of that big prophecy, right, out of that 2,300 years, I'm giving the Jews, your people, right? That's what he says, for your people and your holy city, right? So for Israel, for the Jews, I'm giving you guys 70 weeks. So let me just get a quick calculator here. So 70 weeks. So 70 times 7, right? Because it's 7 days a week. So 490 years. So I'm going to give Israel 490 years to change their ways, right? To make an end of their sins, right? Because when you read the Old Testament, it's a sad story, really. First you have Abraham, and then they forget about God, right? They get enslaved. Then he brings in Moses, and almost right away they're already against God. They're complaining. They make a golden calf, all of this stuff, right? During the time of the judges, it's a mess, right? They're all leaving God. And then finally, they get kings. And King David is a good reign. Solomon is a good reign, I guess. But after Solomon, most of the kings are bad. And Israel just keeps getting further and further away from God. And so God's like, listen, I've given you guys thousands of years, right? I've given you guys 101 different chances. So I'm going to give you guys 490 years to change. If you guys come back to me, right? So if you guys ask for forgiveness, if you guys follow my laws and believe in my Messiah that's going to be coming, then you will still be my people, right? You'll be my chosen generation, and I'll use you to spread the message to the world. If you don't, and we're going to read, he's basically saying, I'm going to go to the rest of the world, right? I'm going to stop treating you guys like a special people. And from now on, the whole world will be my special people, right? I'm not going to make a distinction between a Jew and a Gentile, a Jew and a Roman or a Greek or whatever it is. All of us have an equal chance to learn about God and to be saved, right? So 490 years. Um, the fourth word there, so when it says 70 weeks are determined, the original Hebrew word there is actually cut off. So it literally means I'm cutting out 490 years for the Jews, specifically for the Jews. Now, the obvious question is, cut out from what? Well, if we take the last verse where he says, I'm going to explain the vision, then obviously he's cutting out from that 2,300, right? So out of this long prophecy that I'm sharing with you, until finally the temple is cleansed, I'm cutting out 490 years specifically for the Jews. I'm going to do what I've always done, focus on you guys, right? I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my children. So 490 years to fix your ways, to come back to me. We know that doesn't happen, right? But that's the prophecy. Any questions so far before we move on?
Sorry, you may have said this, but I'm just, my brain is trying to focus.
Yeah.
So of that 490 years that God is giving to the Jews to repent essentially, or to become faithful to him again, two questions. So number one, is God supposedly less focused on other people at this time? And number two, like the Gentiles and stuff. And number two, what happens after the 490 years?
Yeah. So that's how the Jews see it, right? So when the Jews read the words, you're a chosen people, you're my special children, blah blah blah, they take that as, okay, God only cares about us, right? So like even nowadays, my dad, for instance, had a boss who was Jewish, and it's funny. One day he told my dad, it's so bad because you're such a nice person and you're going to hell. And my dad was like, what? Right? And the guy's like, well, you're not Jewish, you know, you're a better person than me, even, kind of a thing, right? But I'm saved just because I'm a Jew, and you're automatically lost because you're a Gentile, right? So that's how the Jews interpreted this idea that you're a chosen generation and you're my holy people and so on. But when you actually read the Old Testament, that's not what God actually is telling them. What he means is, I've chosen you, I've made you special to be like priests to the rest of the world. So I'm using Israel as a tool to reach everyone else. So I'm giving you guys the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, right? The laws. And what they should have done was, okay, we have the laws of God. We're going to live those laws. And what makes Israel special, especially Jerusalem, is that it was kind of the center of the world. So if you were coming from Africa, for instance, you would have to cross through Israel to get to the rest of the world, right? Europe and Asia and so on. If you were in Asia to get to Africa or Europe, you would again have to cross through Israel. So it was this major kind of intersection of trade, which means all different nations used to pass by Israel. What should have happened, this is how evangelism works in the Old Testament. God promises you, like Abraham, I am going to make you filthy rich. I'm going to bless you abundantly. And when people see you, they're going to want your God, right? They're going to want what you have. And what they should have done is, as people came in and like, wow, why are you so rich? Why are you so prosperous? Well, it's because of God. We don't worship these fake gods. We worship God. And because of that, we're blessed. And obviously the other nations would be like, well, then I want your God, right? And they would have conquered the world, right? They would have converted the world. Instead, they did it backwards. So it's like, well, we're holy, we're blessed, so we don't even want to talk to you. We won't even eat with you, kind of a thing, right? And they literally segregated themselves from the rest of the world and did the exact opposite of what God wanted. Because when you read through the Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, multiple books, God talks about reaching the Gentiles, reaching those, right? Even those that aren't of my children, I'm going to bring in. So the message is there. They just rejected it. They wanted to be special and unique and not share God with anyone else. To this day, kind of a thing. So that's really what this means. God is telling them, listen, I'm going to keep you as special. So think of it like the 12 tribes, right? So there was 12 tribes of Israel, but the Levites were cut away. They were special, right? They were they were going to be God's priests whose mission it was to preach to the other 11 tribes, right? So they're kind of God's holy people which would spread the message to the other 11 tribes of Israel. In the same way that the Levites would spread the message to the rest of Israel, Israel was like the Levites. You know, they were supposed to be a holy people who, like the Levites, would spread the message to the rest of the world. And that's what this 490 years is. I'm giving you guys 490 years to be my priests. If you guys don't choose me, then I'm not going to make you my priests anymore. You know, I'm going to use anybody can be my priest after that. Anyone can be my holy people or my chosen generation, which is kind of what Paul talks about. Paul talks about the fact that with Jesus, it's no longer being the blood of Abraham, right? So, like a blood Jew, it's about being spiritual sons of Abraham or spiritual Israel. So, you can be a Greek or a Roman or Portuguese or whatever, and still be spiritual Israel, a spiritual son of Abraham, because in your heart you've accepted it. So that's that transition that we're seeing here. So 490 years to keep the status quo. You'll be my special people, and I'll use you to reach the world. But if you reject that, then I'm going to plan B, which is anyone that wants to be my priest will become my priest, and I'll use them to spread the gospel. That's why Peter, for instance, says, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood." Right? All believers are priests in the New Testament. Question?
Yeah, sorry to get into the nitty gritty of this, but that makes full sense. I understand that. I guess the only question I have is, surely God, prior to this 490 years, would not prevent a Gentile from becoming the priest or spiritual Israel. Or like after the 490 years, if one of those Jews still remained or like repented after.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the point of the barrier?
It was just God's plan, right? Again, when you read the Old Testament, this is where Paul talks about this quite a bit, right? So the first covenant and the second covenant. The first covenant was given to Abraham. Your children will be the sons of God, right? So your children will be that priesthood kind of a thing. It's just a promise that he gave to Abraham because he needed to start somewhere, right? He needed a family line to be completely committed to him. The problem is as Israel grew, it became sloppy, right? Like there was always a few people that were firm, but the vast majority were off doing who knows what, right? But here's the thing, what you're saying is absolutely right. In the Old Testament, there's countless people who aren't Jews that God uses, right? Methuselah, not Methuselah, Melchizedek, who's called a priest of God, wasn't a Jew, and yet Abraham gives him a tithe and all of this stuff. Um, there's the woman that I think we call her a prostitute that like put a cloth out of her window to let the two spies down so they wouldn't get killed.
Yeah.
God saves her. There's this poor lady that Elijah goes to that multiplies the oil and eats bread every day, even though there shouldn't be any more. She's not a Jew, but God saves her. But that's the whole point: is what you see is a Jew interacting with a non-Jew, and they're saved. The second they're saved, and this is what the Jews didn't like. The second they're saved, they become Jewish, right? And they were supposed to continue that work. But the Jews were like, no, 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 no. We're Jews. You guys are something else. And because it was getting a little too mixed, they're like, you know what? Let's just cut it. We're Jews and nobody else.
Yeah.
And even early Christianity, you see that, right? So early Christianity, it took a while for them to accept the Gentile Christians, right? Because they're like, well, we're Jews, we're circumcised, Jesus was a Jew. You guys are like second class, maybe. And it took a while for them to finally, and Paul really had to stress this. There's no difference between a Jew and a Gentile. We're brothers and sisters. So you're absolutely right. There really wasn't a difference, except that God made a promise, and He's like, "Listen, I'm going to use you guys, but as you bring people in, they will become you, and they will continue that same work." In the New Testament, it's not that God rejects the Jews. What He's rejecting is their special status. All right. In fact, Paul even says there, as we get closer to the end, many Jews will be converted. Right. God is not just going to forget them. Right.
Mhm.
Many Jews will accept Christ and be saved, and so on. It really is just that very specialized. I'm choosing you guys to be kind of the holders of God's word. And a good way of explaining this is with Jesus and the woman at the well. So the woman at the well was a Samaritan, which is actually related to she's a Jew theoretically, but she's part of those 10 tribes that separated themselves from Judah and Benjamin, from Jerusalem, basically, right? Like the kingdom was divided. And slowly they started worshiping differently and made their own temple and did all this stuff. When the woman talks with Jesus, she actually asks, she's like, listen, who's right? Is it us or is it you guys, the Jews? And Jesus tells her straight out, listen, the Jews have it right. The Jews are the ones that have the real Bible, that have the real temple, the real teachings of God. And that's really the emphasis, is God chose the Jews to write the Bible, kind of a thing, right? To have the laws of God, to then share it with others. And that's where it went wrong, right? That's where everything went haywire. But God kind of put it upon the Jews to be the people that would write the Old Testament, kind of a thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except for so Jesus validates the Jews like the way the Jews teach.
Yes and no. So he says, yes, we got it right in terms of like the temple and the Bible, the Torah, right? However, and this is where he says the but, right? But the day's coming and now is where it isn't there or here. So it isn't what the Jews are doing or what the Samaritans are doing, but we shall worship God in spirit, right? So it's we're taking away all those traditions, we're taking away all those laws they made up, and real religion will be that really just follows God through the spirit, right? Through the Bible and His teaching. So it's a yes no answer. Yes, in the fact that it's their scriptures, their temple, but not really how they're doing it,
Right.
right? All right, so that's the 490 years. So just remember that time frame because now it's going to be chopped up, and this is kind of where it gets confusing. Verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, talking about Jesus there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. All right. So there's a few different things here. The most important thing that we learn here is the starting date. All right. Because if you remember the 2,300-year prophecy, we have no idea when that starts, right? It doesn't give us a starting date. So there's no way to count to see when it ends. What this is doing is giving us a starting date. So the starting date is the command to restore and build Jerusalem. All right. Luckily, the Bible is going to tell us that, and history will confirm us a date. All right. So that's going to give us a starting date. But basically, from the call to rebuild Jerusalem until until Jesus shows up, it will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. All right. So if you add 62 plus 7, that gives you 69 weeks. All right. So if you remember, Israel is given 70 weeks, but from the beginning of that until Jesus shows up, it's actually only 69 weeks. The reason, and this is it's confusing, the reason why it says 7 weeks and 62 weeks is because it took, let me just double check that it's 49 here. 7, yeah, 7 times 7. So it took about 49 years from the command to rebuild Jerusalem until Jerusalem was like fully built. All right, so he's giving us information here. So it's going to be 70 weeks or 49 years from the call to rebuild until Jerusalem is rebuilt, and then another 62 weeks, which is, and then another 434 years until Jesus shows up. All right, so the call for Jesus to be, the call for Israel to be rebuilt, and then 49 years, the time frame that it took to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and all of that stuff, and then another 434 years for Jesus to show up, for Jesus to be in the picture. Though it's not just Jesus, it actually says the Messiah, right? So the Messiah is actually a title. It's the Christ or the Savior. So it's 69 weeks for the Messiah, the Prince, to be established, right? To start his ministry, to start his conquest, I guess you can call it. Does that make sense? I know there's abundant. Once I show you the picture, it'll be a lot easier to kind of understand the breaking up. But it's basically from the beginning of rebuilding the temple or the city until Jesus shows up is 69 weeks, which gives us one last week, right? 70 were given to Israel, and we've already seen the first 69. So that means that there's only one more week that's given for Israel, or 7 days, 7 years. All right? After the 62 weeks, so at the end of that 69 weeks altogether, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. All right? Now, let me explain this because this is where a lot of people get confused. Most Bible translations put the word to be cut off, all right? Which is accurate. The problem is it's accurate without context. When a lot of people read Messiah shall be cut off, I'll ask you, Sam, what do you think that means? The Messiah shall be cut off. What do you interpret that as?
If I just heard that without any context, I would
Yeah.
think maybe it was the time where like he's on the cross and he feels all the sin and he truly feels disconnected from God.
Yeah, so cut off sounds like dying, right? So, at the end of the 69 weeks, the Messiah is going to be cut off. He's going to be killed, right? That's how a lot of people read this, but not for himself. But this is actually a very specific word in Hebrew. It's a religious word, all right? And let me use the temple to explain it. So the temple was God's house, right? A very special building in God's house. Within that building was like the altar where they would sacrifice the lamb. There was this laver, right? Next week, I think we'll actually talk a little bit about the sanctuary, so you guys will get a bit more context. But there was this pool where the priests would wash themselves. And then they would actually walk into the building area. That was the courtyard. So they would walk into the holy place where there was candlesticks. There was a table with showbread, with 12 loaves of bread. And then at the end, there was an altar of incense. Where the bread and the candlesticks were, there were utensils, right? So knives and spoons, things to, work on the table, right? So maybe to cut the bread or whatever. Those utensils, which were made out of like pure gold, the Bible says that they were cut off specifically for the sanctuary work. What that word cut off means is actually it was, there's a specific word, give me a second. It was consecrated. So it was consecrated specifically for that purpose. So you couldn't just use that knife to make peanut butter and jelly sandwich kind of a thing, right? You couldn't just take a ladle and make soup. Those instruments were separated or consecrated specifically for the temple. That's the word that's being used here. So it's actually what the translation should be is the Messiah shall be consecrated, but not for himself, or the Messiah shall be separated for a special purpose, but not for himself. All right. So this is actually Jesus's anointing. This is his baptism. All right. So if you remember, Jesus was born, right? Miracle birth, the whole Christmas story. But then he kind of lived a normal life, right? Like we don't have a story of his first like 30 plus years, right? He was a carpenter. He lived his life. He did what he did, right? He had a father and a mother and brothers and sisters. I don't know if did he have sisters? I can't remember now. But he had brothers for sure. Um, so for the first 30 years, he was a regular person. But when he was baptized, that's when his ministry began. So that's when Jesus became the Messiah, right? I am now starting my job to save humanity. So for the first 30, plus years, he was a human being, special, sinless, but a human being. But when he was baptized, that's when his ministry begins. All right. So he's cut off or he's consecrated at his baptism to begin his work. All right. And it's because of that, it's because of his baptism that then he's suddenly, sent into the desert and he's tempted by the devil, and because his work is beginning, right? In fact, his first miracle, right there at the wedding feast, he still kind of hasn't really begun yet, which is why he tells Mary, listen, it's not my time yet, right? Like I haven't fully began kind of a thing yet. But Mary's like, no, you have. This is your time, right? So do it. So it's at his baptism that Jesus is cut off or consecrated. And the reason why it says, but not for himself, and Jesus repeats this over and over and over again in the New Testament. What I do not do for myself, but I do for my Father, right? I do for humanity. So this consecration of Jesus wasn't about himself. It was about everyone else. That's why it specifically says he's cut off or he's consecrated, but not for himself. So to give you a comparison, have you ever heard of a Nazarite vow? Have you heard of that before? The Nazarite vow. Samson had a Nazarite vow.
Is it
You,
just about not cutting your hair?
yeah, you can't cut your hair, you can't touch a dead thing, and you can't drink alcohol. Those are like the three big things. Which Samson, by the way, broke all three. But that's besides the point. But anyone could do a Nazarite vow. So let's say um, maybe you're sick, or maybe you need something from God, right? Like there's a very special request that you want from God. You would take a Nazarite vow for maybe a year or a few months, and you would consecrate yourself in this Nazarite vow to get that whatever you were asking for. A person that was doing that was about themselves, right? I'm taking a Nazarite vow so that I can gain something. That isn't what was happening here. All right. That's why it says, but not for himself. So he wasn't consecrating himself so that he can gain something for himself. He was being cut off or consecrating himself for someone else. In this case, for us and for God the Father, right? To accomplish that very specific mission. So that's what it's saying here. So after the 69 weeks, at the end of let me get the date here again, the time frame. After the 400 and well, after the 69 weeks, whatever that is, let me look it up. 69 times 7. So at the end of the 483 years, Jesus was going to get baptized. Jesus was going to start his ministry. So again, remember, so now we have a specific time because we know Jesus was baptized, I think at 30 or 33 AD, something like that, because we know he was 30 something years when he got baptized, right? If you go backwards, that should match up with when the decree came for Israel to be rebuilt, right? Because we have a starting date, and now we have a date for the 69 weeks. And at the last page, we'll see just how perfectly that fits. All right. So at the end of the 69 weeks, Jesus should be ordained or consecrated, set apart, cut off. All right. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be like a flood, until the end of the war, desolation are determined, right? So the big battle occurs when Jesus is consecrated. That's when, all of those prophecies that we've read about the sanctuary being destroyed and God's people being persecuted and stuff like that, that begins with Jesus' baptism. Revelation talks a lot more about this. It talks about how when Jesus, concludes his mission of dying there on the cross, the devil knows that he's lost. But instead of giving up, the Bible says that the devil becomes angry and becomes even more ferocious against the children of God. All right, that's what this bottom part is talking about. So when Jesus begins his ministry, that's when the devil kind of goes into overdrive against God's people. All right, I'll let you read this one here, verses 27.
Sorry, I just have a quick question about the
Yeah,
last
yeah.
verse.
Let's go
So,
back.
it says, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So is this God's people are destroying the sanctuary?
All right, so this is where there's actually two options, and there's kind of debate as to which one is right. Either the prince is talking about Jesus, in which case, when it talks about the sanctuary being destroyed, that's actually Jesus himself. Remember how he says, destroy the temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up again? It's either talking about that, or it's talking about the prince of darkness, which is talking about Satan. So again, when Jesus, begins his ministry and then dies on the cross, Satan literally destroys the city and the sanctuary. Because again, 70 AD, Israel is destroyed, right? The temple is destroyed. So it's either talking symbolically about the sanctuary, in which case the prince is Jesus, or it's talking literally, in which case the prince is Satan, and it's the literal destruction of Israel. They both work. That's the problem. And so there's a debate as to exactly which one is talking about. But to be honest, both of them work, so you can just choose one. Choose which one
Okay.
you prefer.
And
All right?
the last two lines are more
Yeah.
about the end of
The
the
end.
entire
Yeah.
world.
Yeah,
Okay.
because when it talks about the war, desolations are determined, that's directly quoting that little horn power, which brings in the desolations and the destructions and so on.
Right.
So it's kind of jumping into the future there.
And so are we to take the flood as literal?
No, when it says the end will come like a flood, is that the end comes quickly, right? Like after that, everything happens very quickly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Because remember, everything until now that Daniel's been studying is like empire and then another empire, very long kind of stretches of time. This is now talking about very quick things happening, right?
Okay.
So it's like this flood kind of a thing.
Gotcha.
All right, read verse 27.
Okay. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate.
All right, so again, there's two sections here, just like the last verse. The first section we know for sure is talking about Jesus. Very, very simple. So again, we've talked about 69 weeks, right? So 69 out of the 70 weeks. So it's this last week that's being talked about here. So we know at the beginning of the week, Jesus is going to be cut off or consecrated. So Jesus is going to be baptized, right? And then it says that he'll make a covenant with the world, kind of with people, for 1 week or for 7 years. So we know when Jesus was baptized that Jesus, his ministry lasted 3.5 years, right? So he, 3.5 years passed between his baptism and his death on the cross. All right, so it says that he makes a covenant for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, and how much is a middle of the week? 3.5 years. All right, so he's baptized. 3.5 years later, he brings an end to the sacrifice, which is exactly what Jesus dying on the cross is, right? So before Jesus, they would have to bring the lamb, sacrifice the lamb, put the lamb on the altar, and do this every day, right? When Jesus died on the cross, the Bible actually tells us that within the temple, the curtain was cut in half, which therefore means that the temple service comes to an end. There is no more sacrificing sheep after Jesus dies on the cross, because Jesus is the Lamb of God, right? Jesus is not just the kind of foretelling of this lamb. He is the lamb. He is that one sacrifice that we've been prophesying about since Adam and Eve, right? Where we talk about the serpent and he'll step on, the serpent will bite his heel, but he'll step on the head, right? So this sacrifice of someone has been prophesied since the beginning, and finally, in the middle of this week, 3.5 years, the sacrifice comes to an end, right? No more do you have to sacrifice a lamb anymore, because Jesus has become that sacrifice. All right, so 69 weeks have passed, and then we have one more week. 3.5 years of that week, right? 3.5 days of that week is between Jesus being baptized and him dying on the cross, or therefore the gospel, right? The story of Jesus, those 3.5 years. And then there's still 3.5 more years. When you look at it, we don't have a precise date for this, but because all the other dates are going to match up, this is kind of what we assume. This is how long it took. But again, remember the 490 years, the 70-week prophecy was about what? For the Jews, right? So I'm going to focus on the Jews. I'm going to focus on Israel. When you look at the history, so Jesus is baptized. 3.5 years later, Jesus dies on the cross. And then he reappears again after 3 days, right? He talks to the apostles, and then he tells them something very specific. He says this in Acts chapter 1, one of the last times that he sees them. He goes like this: listen, stay in Jerusalem. Stay in Jerusalem, and then when the time comes, you're going to slowly branch out. You're going to go to Samaria, which is still part of Israel, so you're going to stay within Israel, and then at a specific time, you'll go to the rest of the world. That actually happened with a very specific event, all right? And that's the stoning of Stephen. So up until the stoning of Stephen, there was Christians, but they all lived in Israel, right? They lived mostly in Jerusalem, right? They were all there together. But when Stephen was martyred, when he was killed, the Christians got afraid. They're like, well, we can't stay in Israel anymore because now we're being killed. He was the first Christian to be killed. Therefore, let's run, right? And that's where you get this exodus of Christians, and they go to Rome, to Greece, to Africa, to Asia, to India, and suddenly what used to be a Jewish religion has now suddenly become a world religion. Now, we don't have a specific date as to when it happened, but most scholars actually say that it took about 3.5 years before Stephen was actually killed. So that week then is Jesus being baptized, Jesus dying right in the middle of that week, and then that transition period, Stephen is killed, and suddenly it's not about Jerusalem anymore. It's not about Israel anymore. Now it's the world, right? Now it's been opened up to the world, which exactly is what Jesus or what God said. I'm giving you 490 years to fix yourselves, right? So, for instance, if the Jews had stuck with God and read their Bibles, they would have known that Jesus was the Messiah, right? Because his prophecies are all over the place. Unfortunately, they preferred their culture over what he was offering, right? Jesus wasn't offering a special Israel. He was talking about the whole world being saved, right? So they rejected that. And then with Stephen, it's kind of that last straw, right? Stephen is killed, by the way, because he's a Greek. All right, he was a Greek man who kind of was Jewish, really. He followed the laws of God even before becoming a Christian. So he was, I can't remember the name now. The Bible actually gives a specific name for them. I don't know if it's a proselyte or something like that. It basically means a non-Jewish believer. All right. So there was Greeks and Romans that followed the teaching of God, but they were never considered Jews because they didn't have the bloodline, right? So Stephen was one of those men. And when you actually read the story of Acts, the reason they stone him, there's two main reasons. The first one is because he's talking about Jesus, right? And they're like, listen, we don't want you talking about Jesus. We killed him. He's out of the picture. Forget about him. So that's the main reason. The second reason is because Stephen actually quotes the Bible to them. He goes through like the entire Bible in a few chapters, right? Like he just retells the story. And they get upset at the fact that who's this Greek trying to give us our history, right? Like, how dare he try to tell us, we know our history, even though he makes it perfectly clear because he's always putting Jesus into the story, right? And he's like, you guys don't realize that when we talked about Moses, that was talking about Jesus. When we talked about Joseph, that was talking about Jesus, and so on, right? And they get super upset and they finally kill him. And so, what it really is the Jews are kind of once and for all just rejecting not Stephen, but God, right? Rejecting the fact that, Jesus is part of their history. And so it's at that point that Israel ceases to be God's people, right? This is what Paul talks about. So it's not about the bloodline anymore. The bloodline doesn't matter. What matters now is your spirit. You can be spiritually a son of Abraham, spiritually a child of God. And so there's that transition between Israel being special to now anyone in the world is special if they make that choice. Any questions there?
Yeah, so sorry, I think I misunderstood you. I thought you said that after the stoning of Stephen, it was the Jews that spread everywhere, but no, it was not.
The Christian
The
Jews, right?
Christian Jews. Okay.
Because before Stephen's death, um, everyone that's becoming Christian is a Jew, right? Because they're in Jerusalem. Now, there's some people like Stephen who aren't blood Jews, but are basically Jewish. They follow all the traditions, they follow all the rules. So, they're basically Jewish. They're just not considered Jewish. But it's just that idea that, this idea of a special people, right? It's not about Israel anymore. It goes off to the rest of the world. All right. And then the second half, again, we usually kind of project this into, because of the wording, again, that little horn power is actually called the abomination of desolation. And those are the words that we see here, right? And on the wings of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. So again, we're talking about that future time period where God's people are being killed until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate until, he's able to do his evil work and God puts an end to it, kind of a thing. All right. Yeah, go
Sorry,
ahead.
really quick. Did you explain what the purpose of, so you did explain that like 3.5 years in, okay, sorry, of that 1 week.
Yeah.
So the first 3.5 years, what does that covenant, like why actually the whole week?
Yeah.
Why
So again,
did
remember the focus here, because remember the angel Gabriel, right, is talking to Daniel. Daniel is a Jew, right? Daniel really only cares about the Jews. The reason why he's sick every time he gets a vision is because the only thing he cares about is Israel being rebuilt, the temple being rebuilt, going back to the sacrifices, and just going back to life as normal, right? Going back to Israel and the king and, the life that he remembers. Gabriel is basically saying, listen, you guys are only going to get 490 years, right? So when it says that he, Jesus, right, then he, Jesus, shall confirm a covenant with many, he's specifically talking about the Jewish nation, right? So it's like Jesus saying, listen, I'm giving you guys one last week, right? 7 more years to change your mind. If you guys accept me, if you guys accept God, then you'll still be that special people which will preach to the world, right? You'll kind of have that heightened status, right? Like priests. If you guys don't change in this last week, then I'm just gonna go to the rest of the world, right? I'm not gonna use you specifically as priests. I'm gonna use whoever I can find, right? And Stephen is kind of that linchpin, right? That last chance for the Jews to be kind of this special people, right? So this is the picture. So this is the one that usually helps a lot of people to understand kind of all the dating, all right? So again, so 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, which is, 70 times 7 is 490 years. Oh, let me go back. So 490 years. We know that the beginning of this prophecy is the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. All right. Oh, I don't think I have the verse here. Let me look it up quickly. The Bible tells us, so let me see here. Rebuilding Jerusalem, 57 BC. All right. So let me see if I can look this up quickly. There's 2 decrees that are mentioned, all right? One is found in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, and in chapter 6, verse 1. And then there's a second one in Second Chronicles, or it actually goes together. In Second Chronicles 36:22. Next week I'll give you guys these verses. I forgot. I should have had these in. All right. So there's 2 decrees though. One was made by Cyrus, I believe. And then one was made by Artaxerxes. So 2 different kings who kind of promised Israel, okay, you can go and rebuild. But one kind of never really happened, and the other one did. The one that did is the Artaxerxes one. All right, so that's the one that's found in Ezra 7, verses 8 and 9, I believe. I'll have to double check this afterwards. But it actually says, like, at so many years in the reign of Artaxerxes, he made this decree that Israel can go back and rebuild and so on. All right. So if you actually go into history and you look at the 7th year, it's 457. All right. So next week I'll give you the details, but for now, just trust me, I guess, on this one. All right. So we know that the prophecy begins again with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. That decree is in the Bible. That's what's nice. It actually says, I think it's like the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, he made this decree. All right. So next week I'll actually show you that verse. And then when you look at it historically, it points us to 557 BC. And then it says that there would be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 70 weeks takes us to about 408 BC, which is roughly how long it took to rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple, rebuild the houses, and kind of make Israel Israel again. All right. So it took about 49 years, and then another 434 years to get this point where it talks about the Messiah will be cut off, right? Will be consecrated, which happens at 27 AD. All right. And then we have that last week, that last 7 years. We know it was 3.5 years from his baptism until his death. Jesus died around 31 AD. And then another 3.5 years, which takes us to 34 AD, which is the stoning of Stephen. All right. Daniel, that's why I said Daniel chapter 9. The Jews don't know what to do with this book, because any Jew today can read Ezra, and learn about, when Artaxerxes made that decree. They can go on Wikipedia or whatever and find out that date, right? because here's the thing, we know that this 490 years is connected to that larger prophecy, that 2,300. But even if you don't include that, even if you just use chapter 9, right? The 70 weeks, it tells us when it begins, 400, it tells us that it's the beginning of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And then it's the 69 weeks, which takes us exactly when Jesus was baptized. And then 3.5 years later, Jesus dies on the cross. So just between those three dates, you know, how does a Jew reject Jesus, right? Like it's in their own Bible. This isn't the New Testament, right? This is the Old Testament. This is a prophet that they believe in. It's in their own scriptures, and it's telling them, listen, from the time Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt until the Messiah is cut off, is consecrated, is exactly when Jesus was baptized. And then 3.5 years later, exactly when Jesus dies on the cross. And then if you want to add the final one, 3.5 years later, the Jews kill the first Christian and the Christians go off into the world. Therefore, God now is going out into the world. No one else in history fits these dates, right? There's no one else in history that was baptized and died exactly on those dates, right? And so that's why, chapter 9 is one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament that point to Jesus, right? We know that there's thousands of prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament. But to be honest, a lot of those are vague, right? So, for instance, none of his bones will be broken. Okay, that works for Jesus, but it works for a lot of people, right? He'll be born of a virgin. That one's harder, right? Not too many people in history have that one. But yeah, so there, that one's an important one. Um, Even this, if you remember the Christmas story, for instance, so the birth of Jesus, you have the wise men, right? The wise men come from the east. Most scholars actually put them into Iran, which is in those days Medo-Persia. All right. You have to remember that the king, so King Artaxerxes, King Darius, and them, they conquered Israel, and the Jews, especially Daniel and so on, they kept their positions, and so Judaism was well known to these kings, and the Bible, their holy scriptures, is or was in Medo-Persia. These wise men, which were, people that studied books and so on, they would have had Daniel. They would have had this scroll of Daniel, which is why when they see the star and so on, they're using the Jewish scriptures. The Bible talks about the star, and the coming of the king and so on. So these wise men were using the Torah, were using the Jewish scriptures when they follow the star and end up at King Herod's place. When King Herod meets the wise men, he goes to the priests, right? King Herod goes to, the scholars, and he's like, what are these guys talking about, right? Like, is the Messiah coming? And they're all like, yeah, this is the time period. The time period works. Why? Because they were using Daniel, right? They knew the beginning of Jerusalem. They knew how long it was going to take, which is why they're like, yeah, the odds are this is roughly when the Messiah is going to be born, because, in 30 years from now, he's going to be anointed, when he becomes a man, kind of a thing. So they were actually using the book of Daniel, because Daniel is the only book that actually gives us dates, right, as to when Jesus was going to do his thing. And so the Jews knew Daniel. Jews knew this prophecy, which is why King Herod goes off and he tries to kill all the kids, right? Because he's trying to wipe out this prophecy. But obviously God doesn't allow that, right? So that's why modern Jews, so ancient Jews, the ones in Jesus's day, they still consider Daniel a prophetic book, right? Because they themselves used it to point that, yeah, Jesus, yeah, he should be roughly being born now. The Jews nowadays, because they reject Jesus, they have to reject this entire book, and that's why they say that the book of Daniel isn't a prophetic book; it's a historical book only. There is really no prophecy because they have to reject this, right? Um, but as a Christian, this is one of the best proofs that no, Jesus, yes, he existed, he was baptized, he died, just like, specifically date wise, just like the Bible prophesies. So that's why I love Daniel 9. It is a little bit confusing, right? The weeks and da, 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 da. But once you actually put the dates down and you kind of make the graph, it's crazy. It's crazy how accurate it is. Any questions?
Yeah, so where was the original, like at the very beginning of the chapter when you said that Daniel was like focused on 70 weeks or something?
70 weeks. Yeah.
So where was
Um,
that from? Like what text was that?
so that's from Jeremiah. Let me see if I can find it here. Let me look quickly in the Bible here. So much better when you can use a phone, right? You can just
Yeah.
search instead of trying to go through the Bible. So it's for sure it's in Jeremiah.
Okay.
So I just let me just put in 70 years. Oop. 70. Boy, my spell checker isn't working. 70 years. Chronicles, Psalms, Isaiah. Okay, so I think it's Jeremiah 25. Yeah, so Jeremiah 25 verse 12 says this. Wow, there's actually, it repeats it a couple of times. So let me go to, so the title of the chapter, at least in my Bible, it says 70 years of desolation, right? If you go to verse 11, it says this, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. All right, so it's basically, so this land is Israel, right? He's talking about where he is. So Jeremiah is in Israel, and so he's like, so this land will be desolate for 70 years, right? Will be destroyed by Babylon for 70 years. And then verse 12, then it will come to pass when the 70 years are completed that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says the Lord, and I will make it a perpetual desolation. All right. So here's the problem, and this is where you read a prophecy and you read it the way you want to read it, right? Instead of actually looking at what it's saying.
Mhm.
The 70 years that's being talked about here, not once does it say that Israel's going to come back, right? The specific language is Israel will be destroyed by Babylon for 70 years. And then verse 12, at the end of that 70 years, Babylon will be destroyed, right? So for a Jew, in their minds, well, if Babylon is destroyed, that means we get our land back. What they don't realize, and this is where Daniel comes in, and where Daniel gets all upset because he's like, wait, you're telling me after Babylon there's going to be another empire, the Medo-Persians, and we're still going to be under them, and then Greece, and then Rome, right, and so on. That's where, so when he's reading Jeremiah, and he's like, no, God, you're saying 70 years. Let's stop there. But nowhere in this chapter does it actually say that after 70 years, Israel comes back. It's the opposite. It says that after 7 years, Babylon is destroyed, right? So it doesn't say what happens to Israel. Unfortunately, what happens is Medo-Persia takes over, right, and becomes dominant. The only difference being is it's during the reign of Medo-Persia that God basically, I guess, inspires the king of Persia to give Israel kind of back its status, right? So I'm going to let you guys go back. You can rebuild the walls, rebuild a temple, and kind of you'll be your own country, but you're going to be a country under another country. So you'll still be under the reign of Persia, but at least you'll have your land back, kind of a thing. You'll be semi-autonomous, kind of like I don't know, Quebec, right? Like
Mhm.
Quebec's part of Canada, but you're your own nation, right? Like you guys do your own thing. That's what Israel basically became, right? So, for instance, with Rome, the temple was rebuilt. The Jews had their laws, they lived their lives, but always under the shadow of Rome, right? They still had to pay their taxes. They still couldn't do everything that they wanted, right? The Romans would kind of put a limit. So that's basically what Israel turned into, right?
Mhm.
Um, does
So
that
at
make
what,
sense?
yeah, that makes sense. At what point then is it more in the New Testament that our like doesn't our current world get called Babylon at points? Or like,
Yeah, so that's in Revelation. So in the Old Testament, um, Israel was actually conquered a couple of times, right? So in the Old Testament, the first one to kind of conquer Israel, kind of, but not really, is Egypt, right? But that's because they actually went to Egypt, right? So if you remember Joseph, he brings his whole family in, and they live in a certain part of Egypt. So they kind of walked into that one themselves. Because the
Mhm.
problem is that Pharaoh was nice. That Pharaoh liked the Jews. But the following pharaohs were like, who are these guys? Why are they living in our best land? Why don't we just enslave them? So they became slaves, right? So that's the first time that Israel is enslaved.
Mhm.
And then Moses shows up, delivers them, right? They conquer Israel, they take Israel. But then the Assyrians show up and they get conquered again, right? And you'll know like the Philistines, right? We know the Philistines kind of conquered, and that's the story of Samson and that. Um, but then when the kings came around, they they kind of fortified themselves. With the kings, Israel became this mighty nation, at least at the beginning. Unfortunately, after Solomon, his son was an idiot, right? And the people went to Solomon's son. They're like, listen, Solomon was a hard king, right? He taxed us a lot. If you're nice to us, if you don't overtax us, we'll serve you for life. And the king, he went to the wise men and they're like, yeah, you should do what the people want. But he's like, no, I don't like that answer. So he went to his own friends. And the friends were like, no, you should do the exact opposite. You should be even harder on them. And that's what he tells them. He's like, you know what? You thought my father was bad. I'm gonna like double the taxes. I'm gonna be twice as hard. And when he said that, another guy, I think Jeroboam was his name, he's like, all right, if that's what you're going to be, then we're just going to leave. So 10 of the tribes of Israel separated, right? And so that became Israel, the northern part of God's land. And then Judah and Benjamin, just a little piece of nothing, became Judah, right? Which is where like Jesus comes from.
Right.
Um, so when they separated, the Assyrians came and took basically the northern kingdom that disappeared, which is why the 10 tribes of Israel kind of disappeared. It's like this big mystery nowadays who they were. Um, but after that, Babylon shows up. Babylon is worse than Egypt and Assyria combined. So Babylon comes in, doesn't just enslave them, but literally destroys everything. Every house, every wall, the temple is just put into ruins. Because of that, Babylon kind of became symbolic as to like the great enemy of God's people. All right. So from then on, even after Babylon was destroyed, so even during the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Greeks or the Romans, for instance, the Jews used to look at Rome and be like, Rome is Babylon. All right. They're just as bad as Babylon. And that imagery stuck. So when we get to Revelation, Babylon becomes every nation that's against God, right? It becomes kind of like this superpower. It actually becomes a harlot, a prostitute. It's called the mother of harlots, Babylon, the mother of prostitutes. But we'll get to that when we get into Revelation. So really, Babylon is it's symbolic in that sense. It just there was a literal Babylon like that we talked about, but after Babylon is destroyed, Babylon becomes this kind of image of the great enemy of God's people because it's the one that destroyed them, right? So that's where that Babylon comes from. So nowadays, it's become pop culture to a certain degree. They're like,
Oh,
oh, that's Babylon, right? Like that's evil kind of a thing.
right.
And that's because of kind of that history there.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Are we
No.
good? All right. So hopefully those that are watching the recording, hopefully you guys don't have questions. If you do, send me a text. Next week though, so next week, I'll talk about those verses about the rebuilding the Jerusalem, so you guys can have that background there. And we'll do a quick study on just the temple. All right. Because if you remember in chapter 8, that long prophecy, that 2,300 one, we don't know when it started, but we know how it ends. It ends with the sanctuary being cleansed, which really screwed people up in history because they thought, well, the sanctuary must represent the earth, and being cleansed must be the second coming. And so there's actually a time in history called the Great Disappointment, because everyone thought Jesus was coming back, and then the day went by, and everyone's like, okay, that didn't happen, right? And so it's become known as the Great Disappointment. But that's because they misinterpreted what it means, the sanctuary being cleansed. So that's why next week we'll study the temple and the ceremonies that were done there, because one of the ceremonies, one of the most important one, which is called the Day of Atonement, is literally the sanctuary being cleansed. All right. And so what we're going to see is that the end of that big prophecy, which now we have a starting date, right? We know that the start of that prophecy is 457. So we actually know what year, which ends up being the Great Disappointment, but that's a different story, is when the sanctuary is cleansed and what that actually means. So it's something that's actually already happened in history, but it's actually connected to the second coming. It's I would almost put it as like it's the first step of the second coming, this time of the end kind of a thing. So we'll do that next week. So if you do have any questions about this, that's fine, because next week we're still gonna be in the same topic. All right. So if anyone has any questions, then just you can ask it next week. All right. So I guess I'll end that here. I'll stop recording and we'll finish off with a prayer.